The wind that blew across RAF Lutchers carried the smell of frozen earth and aviation fuel, and it cut through Flight Sergeant Thomas Brennan's leather jacket as he stood alone on the dispersal area, staring at the ugliest aircraft he had ever seen. The Bristol Beaufighter sat on its landing gear like a bull waiting to charge, its twin Hercules engines mounted on thick wings, its nose stubby and aggressive where cannon ports glinted in the weak morning light. Ground crews moved around it with practiced efficiency, but Tommy noticed how the other pilots walked past without a second glance. Nobody wanted to fly the Beaufighter. Nobody except the men who had no other choice. 3 weeks ago, Tommy had been a Spitfire pilot. 3 weeks ago, he had been part of something beautiful and deadly, dancing through the sky in the most graceful fighter ever built. Then came the mission over Dieppe. Then came the moment when his squadron leader's plane caught fire and Tommy froze at the controls, watching his friend spiral into the channel while his own hands refused to move. The review board called it combat fatigue. The other pilots called it cowardice. The brass transferred him to Coastal Command and gave him this, a twin-engine beast that German pilots mocked as slow and heavy, a plane designed not for dogfights but for hunting bombers over the cold waters of the North Sea. A voice broke through his thoughts. Flight Sergeant Brennan. Tommy turned to see a young man approaching, barely 20 years old, with pale features and eyes that held something hard beneath their surface. I'm Sergeant Peter Oakes. They've assigned me as your navigator. Tommy studied him. The navigator's uniform was pressed too perfectly, his salute too crisp. Fresh from training. Ever been in combat, Oakes? No, sir. Ever seen a man die? Peter's jaw tightened. My brother. Over London, during the Blitz. He was flying a Hurricane. A Heinkel gunner got him. Tommy understood then. This wasn't just another assignment for Peter Oakes. This was personal. He recognized the look because he saw it in his own mirror every morning, the hunger for something that combat could never truly satisfy. The Beaufighter isn't what you're expecting, Tommy said, turning back toward the aircraft. She's not fast. She's not nimble. The Germans laugh at her. Then why do we fly her? Tommy pointed at the nose. Beneath the metal cowling sat 4 Hispano 20mm cannons, each capable of firing 700 rounds per minute. Below the wings hung additional machine guns. The Beaufighter carried more firepower than any single-engine fighter in the RAF. Because when those cannons speak, Tommy said quietly, bombers fall out of the sky. The days that followed were filled with training flights and frustrated silences. Peter struggled to master the Mark IV airborne interception radar, a device so new that half the technicians couldn't explain how it worked. The green scope showed blips and shadows, contacts that might be enemy aircraft or might be nothing at all. Tommy flew with mechanical precision but no heart. The old instincts were buried somewhere beneath the gilt. When they spotted a lone German reconnaissance plane during a patrol, Peter urged him to pursue. Tommy calculated the distance, the fuel, the odds. By the time he made his decision, the enemy had vanished into cloud cover. That night, Peter found Tommy in the officers' mess, drinking alone. You let him go, Peter said, sitting down uninvited. You had the angle. You had the speed. You let him go. I made a tactical decision. You were afraid. Tommy's hand tightened around his glass. The words stung because they were true. He had felt it again, that paralysis, that cold weight in his chest that turned his muscles to stone. The Spitfire had been an extension of his body. The Beaufighter felt like a coffin with wings. Before he could respond, a squadron leader burst through the door. All pilots to briefing. Now. The room filled with tension as intelligence officers pinned photographs to the board. German bomber formations had been detected massing in Norway. Heinkel He-111s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, were preparing for a major strike on British industrial targets. Coastal Command would intercept them over the North Sea. Every Beaufighter would fly. Tommy stared at the reconnaissance photos, neat rows of bombers on distant airfields, each one carrying enough ordnance to flatten a city block. Somewhere in Britain, families slept without knowing what was coming. His sister had slept like that once, in Liverpool, before the bombs fell. Peter appeared beside him. "This is why we're here," the young navigator said. "This is what those 4 cannons are for." Tommy said nothing. But as he walked back toward the dispersal area, toward the slow and heavy beast waiting in the darkness, he felt something stir beneath the fear. It might have been purpose. It might have been rage. Whatever it was, it tasted like the beginning of something that could not be stopped. 12 Beaufighters rose into the Scottish darkness like shadows separating from the earth, their twin engines roaring against the frozen wind as they climbed toward the clouds. Tommy felt the familiar vibration through his control column, the heavy responsiveness of an aircraft built not for grace but for violence. Behind him, Peter hunched over the radar scope, its pale green glow painting his face in ghostly light. Neither man spoke. There was nothing left to say. The briefing had been clear. A formation of German bombers had departed Norway 2 hours earlier, flying low to avoid detection, their course plotted directly toward Newcastle and its vital shipyards. Coastal Command would intercept them over the North Sea, far from land, where falling aircraft would vanish into black water without witnesses. The Beaufighters carried no external lights. Radio silence was absolute. They flew by instruments and instinct, trusting the darkness to hide them from enemy eyes. At 12,000 feet, the formation entered a wall of cloud so thick that Tommy lost sight of the aircraft beside him. The Beaufighter bucked and shuddered as turbulence gripped its wings. Ice began forming on the canopy, creeping across the glass in crystalline fingers. Tommy remembered the meteorological officer's warning: conditions would deteriorate rapidly, and there would be no second chances if they lost their bearings. One by one, the other aircraft disappeared from radar contact. The formation scattered. Within 20 minutes, Tommy and Peter were alone. "I'm getting something," Peter said, his voice tight. "Multiple contacts, bearing 045. Range 15 miles. They're flying in formation." Tommy's stomach clenched. He adjusted course, descending slowly to approach from below. The Bristol Beaufighter had many weaknesses. Its roll rate was sluggish, its climb speed unimpressive, its silhouette unmistakable, but it had one advantage that German pilots consistently underestimated. At night, approaching from beneath, the aircraft was nearly invisible against the blackness of the sea. "Contact count increasing," Peter reported. "I'm seeing 12 bombers. No, more. There's a second formation behind them. And something else. Smaller contacts, faster. Escorts." Tommy's hands tightened on the controls. Bf-110s. The Luftwaffe's twin-engine night fighters, equipped with their own radar systems, crewed by men who had spent years perfecting the art of killing in darkness. The Heinkel bombers were dangerous enough with their defensive armament. Each one carried multiple machine gun positions that could turn an attacking fighter into wreckage. But the Bf-110s were hunters, as deadly as anything the Germans had put in the air. "We should call for support," Peter said. "Radio silence. They'll reach Newcastle in 40 minutes. Thousands of people, I know." Tommy stared into the darkness ahead. His sister had been 17. She had been working a night shift at a munitions factory when the bombers came. The shelter had taken a direct hit. They never found enough of her to bury that. He pushed the throttle forward. The approach took 7 minutes. 7 minutes of climbing pulse and sweating palms, of watching the radar contacts grow larger and more defined. Peter counted bombers aloud, Heinkels arranged in defensive box formations, their gunners scanning the sky with methodical precision. The Bf-110 escorts weaved through the formation, alert for exactly the kind of attack Tommy was planning. 400 yards, Peter whispered. 300. I can see him. Lead bomber, slightly below us. Tommy saw it too. The Heinkel He-111 was a distinctive aircraft, its glazed nose giving it an almost organic appearance, like some deep-sea creature drifting through liquid darkness. Through gaps in the cloud, moonlight caught its wings. The bomber's crew had no idea what was coming. Tommy aligned his gun sight. The Beaufighter's four 20mm Hispano cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage, beneath the cockpit floor. Each cannon fired high-explosive shells capable of tearing through armor plating. Together, they could put over 50 rounds into a target in a single second. The Germans called this kind of firepower excessive. Tommy called it necessary that he pressed the firing button. The world exploded into light and thunder. Tracers streaked toward the Heinkel like solid bars of fire. The bomber's wing shattered as cannon shells punched through fuel tanks and structural supports. Flame erupted from the engine nacelle, spreading instantly across the aircraft's back. Tommy watched the Heinkel begin its death roll, trailing fire like a comet as it plunged toward the sea below. The entire engagement had lasted less than 3 seconds. Direct hit, Peter breathed. My God. Direct hit. But there was no time for satisfaction. Across the formation, gunners had spotted the muzzle flash. Searchlights mounted on the bombers began sweeping the sky. And behind them, 2 Bf-110s broke from their patrol pattern, their engines howling as they accelerated toward the source of the attack. Tommy threw the Beaufighter into a dive. The airframe groaned. Warning lights flickered. Behind him, Peter gripped his seat and prayed. The hunters had become the hunted. And the slow, heavy beast was running out of sky. The first cannon shell punched through the Beaufighter's tail section with a sound like a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil, and Tommy felt the aircraft shudder as fragments tore through aluminum skin. Red tracer rounds streaked past the canopy, close enough that he could see their rotation, and somewhere behind him a Bf-110 pilot was lining up for the killing shot. Tommy shoved the control column forward and dove toward the sea, the altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 8,000 feet. 6,000. 4,000. The North Sea appeared below them, black and endless, its surface rippled by wind that would turn any crash into an instant grave. Tommy pulled back on the controls at 1,500 feet, feeling the blood drain from his head as gravity pressed him into his seat. The Beaufighter groaned like a wounded animal but held together. Behind them, the pursuing Bf-110 overshot its attack run, its pilot unprepared for such a desperate maneuver. He's coming around again, Peter reported, his voice cracking. Second contact is cutting off our route home. We're boxed in. Tommy didn't respond. His mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with geometry. The Bf-110 was faster in level flight, more maneuverable in turns, equipped with cannons and machine guns that could tear the Beaufighter apart. But the German pilot was trained to fight aircraft that behaved predictably, that followed doctrine, that tried to escape. Tommy had stopped trying to escape. He had stopped caring about survival. All that remained was the mathematics of killing. What are you doing? Peter demanded as Tommy banked hard to port. You're flying toward him. The Beaufighter can take more punishment than any fighter in this war, Tommy said quietly. That's why they built her this way. That's why she's slow and heavy. She's meant to absorb hits and keep fighting. The lead Bf-110 grew larger in the windscreen, its twin engines glowing against the darkness. Tommy could see the flashes of its forward armament beginning to fire, the bright sparks of tracer rounds reaching toward him. He held his course. Rounds struck the Beaufighter's nose, punching holes in the metal cowling. The port engine coughed as something damaged its fuel feed. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Tommy ignored them all. At 200 yards, the German pilot realized what was happening. He tried to break away, to pull up and escape the collision course, but his reaction came too late. Tommy's thumb found the firing button. The 4 Hispano cannons unleashed their fury at point-blank range, and the Bf-110 simply came apart. Its canopy disintegrated. Its nose section crumpled inward. Fire erupted from both engine nacelles simultaneously, and the aircraft transformed into a tumbling mass of debris that swept past the Beaufighter close enough to scrape paint from the wing. Mother of God, Peter whispered. Tommy had no time for reflection. The second Bf-110 was still out there, its pilot now fully aware of what he faced. The German would be cautious, methodical, waiting for the damaged Beaufighter to make a mistake. And the bomber formation continued its course toward Newcastle, unconcerned with the small battle raging in its wake. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Tommy asked. Peter checked the gauges. "Maybe 40 rounds per cannon. Enough for one pass." "And fuel?" 90 minutes if we're lucky. Less if we keep maneuvering." Tommy studied the radar scope. The bomber contacts were pulling away, their speed carrying them steadily toward the British coast. Somewhere beyond the horizon, families slept in their beds. Factory workers walked home through darkened streets. Children dreamed of peace that seemed impossibly distant. In 40 minutes, those people would learn whether Coastal Command had succeeded or failed. "We can make it home," Peter said carefully. "If we turn now, if we nurse the engines, we can reach the coast before dawn. We've done enough. One bomber down, one fighter destroyed. That's more than most crews achieve in a month." "It's not enough. Tommy, my sister's name was Catherine." Tommy's voice was steady, almost gentle. "She was going to be a teacher. She used to read me stories when I was scared of the dark. The bomb that killed her was dropped by a Heinkel just like those." He pointed toward the distant radar contacts. "Every one of them that gets through will kill someone's Catherine. Someone's brother. Someone's child." Peter fell silent. The Beaufighter flew on through the darkness, its damaged engine trailing thin smoke, its fuselage perforated with bullet holes. Behind them, the second Bf-110 circled like a patient vulture, waiting for its moment to strike. "Then let's not let them through," Peter finally said. Tommy looked back at his navigator. The young man's face was pale, his shoulder dark with blood where a fragment had grazed him during the first attack. But his eyes held something new, not fear, not anger, but the quiet acceptance of men who have found their purpose. Tommy turned the Beaufighter toward the bombers. The last pass was coming. One way or another, it would be the end. Dawn bled across the eastern horizon like a wound opening in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold that Tommy would have found beautiful under different circumstances. Instead, he focused on the 6 Heinkel bombers ahead of him, their silhouettes growing sharper as night surrendered to morning. The bomber formation had tightened its defensive box, gunners now alert and ready after witnessing their comrades fall. Behind Tommy, somewhere in the gray space between sea and cloud, the surviving Bf-110 stalked its prey with the patience of a professional killer. The Beaufighter's port engine had begun running rough, its temperature gauge climbing steadily toward the red zone. Oil leaked from somewhere in the cowling, leaving a thin trail that vanished into the slipstream. Peter's breathing came in short gasps, the fragment wound in his shoulder had worsened, and blood had soaked through his flight suit to stain the seat beneath him. Neither man mentioned these things. There was no point. 400 yards to the formation, Peter reported. 38 rounds remaining per cannon. The 110 is hanging back, probably waiting for us to commit. Tommy understood the German pilot's thinking. Attack the bombers, expose your tail, die in flames. It was simple mathematics, the kind that had governed aerial combat since the first aircraft rose over the Western Front a generation ago. But mathematics assumed rational actors, pilots who wanted to survive, men who would break off when the odds turned against them. Tommy had stopped being that kind of pilot somewhere over the North Sea, in the darkness between one heartbeat and the next that he climbed above the bomber formation, using the rising sun as a weapon. The German gunners would be half-blind looking into that light, their eyes watering, their aim compromised. It was a trick as old as aviation itself, and it worked because it exploited the one disadvantage that technology could never overcome, the fragility of human senses. Coming in high, Tommy announced. I'll take the lead elements. You call corrections. The 110 is accelerating. He's making his move. I know. The dive began. The Beaufighter's airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour, its control surfaces heavy with the pressure of compressed air. Tommy lined up on the nearest Heinkel, watching its gunners struggle to track him through the blinding sunrise. His finger found the firing button and held it down, the cannons hammered. Tracers drew bright lines through the morning air. The Heinkel's glazed nose shattered as 20mm shells tore through the cockpit, killing both pilots instantly. The bomber rolled onto its back and plunged toward the sea, but Tommy was already shifting his aim, walking his fire across the formation with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. A second Heinkel caught fire. Its fuel tanks erupted in a blossom of orange flame that consumed the aircraft's midsection. A third lost its entire tail assembly to a concentrated burst, spinning helplessly as aerodynamic forces tore it apart. Tommy heard Peter shouting corrections, felt the aircraft buck as defensive fire began finding its mark, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Every bomber that fell was a street that wouldn't burn, a family that wouldn't die, a Catherine who would grow up to become a teacher. The fourth bomber exploded so close that debris struck the Beaufighter's canopy, cracking the glass and filling the cockpit with the smell of smoke and burning aviation fuel. Tommy's ammunition counter hit 0. The cannons fell silent, then the Bf-110 struck, cannon shells raked the Beaufighter from tail to nose. The starboard engine died instantly, its propeller windmilling uselessly as fire licked from the nacelle. Peter screamed as more fragments tore through the fuselage. The control column went heavy in Tommy's hands, the aircraft rolling drunkenly to port as hydraulic fluid sprayed from severed lines. Tommy braced for the final burst, the one that would finish them. He thought of Catherine reading to him by lamplight. He thought of Peter's brother falling through a London sky. He thought of all the slow and heavy aircraft that had fought and died in this war, piloted by men who knew they would never be celebrated like the Spitfire aces, who went up night after night into the darkness knowing that the odds would eventually catch them. The killing burst never came. Instead, two shapes dropped from the clouds above the Bf-110, sleek, twin-engine silhouettes that Tommy recognized immediately. De Havilland Mosquitoes, the wooden wonders of the RAF, their own cannons already firing. The German pilot tried to evade, but he had spent too long focused on Tommy, and the Mosquitoes gave him no chance. The Bf-110 disintegrated under combined fire from 8 aircraft cannons, its wreckage spinning down to join the bombers it had failed to protect. Tommy didn't remember the flight home. The next clear image in his mind was the Beaufighter touching down at an emergency airfield on the Scottish coast, one engine dead and the other screaming, its landing gear barely functional after the damage it had absorbed. Ground crews rushed toward the smoking aircraft as it rolled to a stop. Medics pulled Peter from the rear cockpit, his shoulder wound serious but survivable. An Air Vice Marshal was waiting when Tommy climbed down from the wing. The senior officer looked at the battered Beaufighter, its skin punctured by over 70 bullet and shell impacts, its engines ruined, its canopy cracked, its interior painted with blood and hydraulic fluid, and shook his head in disbelief. "Intelligence says the Germans have started calling your aircraft something new," the Air Vice Marshal said. "Der Flüstern Tod. The Whispering Death. Apparently, by the time you hear those 4 cannons, you're already dead." Tommy looked back at the ruined Beaufighter, the slow and heavy beast that had carried him through the longest night of his life. Ground crews were already beginning to assess the damage, to determine whether the aircraft could be repaired or would be scrapped for parts. "She's not whispering anymore," Tommy said quietly. "But she got us home." He walked toward the medical tent where Peter was waiting, leaving the Beaufighter behind. There would be other missions, other nights, other bombers to hunt. The war would continue until one side or the other could no longer bear the cost. But for this morning, in this place, the slow and heavy aircraft had proven what it was built for. Sometimes, being deadly mattered more than being fast.